18 decades have now passed since the Newport Rising of 1839, and yet clearly there still remains a great deal to discover about Chartism in South Wales. There are many different individual stories that are yet to be fully explored. This is why this presentation is entitled In Search of Jenkin Morgan. So much of what has been written since about 1840 is focused almost inevitably on John Frost, Zephaniah Williams and William Jones, the three Welsh martyrs. My aim here, therefore, is to deal with a far more obscure figure, and yet someone who played a very significant role in Welsh Chartism, and indeed in the Rising itself. Curiously, many modern historians have failed to acknowledge Jenkin Morgan, or indeed the four other men who were sentenced to death at Monmouth in 1840. The starting point for my interest in Jenkin Morgan, I guess, began with a lecture given by Professor Ivor Wilkes at the Westgate Hotel, Newport, on the evening of the 1st of November 1989. His book, South Wales and the Rising of 1839, had just been published only 5 years earlier. He spoke with a great deal of enthusiasm about the Rising and of the events that had brought such a swift reaction from the state. As he talked of this pill milkman, Jenkin Morgan, he laid down a marker in my imagination. Here was a radical Chartist, hell-bent on political revolution, and yet returning to deliver milk on the streets of Pill. The cameo that Wilkes painted provided a very different picture of Chartism in South Wales. And yet, when considering the life of Jenkin Morgan in the years since, thoughts of another historian have regularly come to my mind. In the early 1980s, Michael Wood burst onto the scene with the first of his television histories, In Search of the Dark Ages. He broke the mould of rigid and, quite frankly, rather boring history documentaries, replacing static historians such as A.J.P. Taylor with an effervescent enthusiasm. In March 1981, the Radio Times reviewed the second series of In Search of the Dark Ages. It commented that this 32-year-old history man glowed with exuberance, charm and delight. Wood's presentation of history was very different. Forensically scouring the British landscape for clues, his style was new and innovative. He jumped out of helicopters draped in a sheepskin flying jacket in search of Alfred the Great, Athelstan and Eric Bloodaxe. Suddenly these figures from the distant past were vividly resurrected, and commentators heaped praise on Wood for the infectious enthusiasm of this trendy new BBC wonder boy. And so I intend here to borrow Michael Wood's now established catchphrase, and hence my title, In Search of Jenkin Morgan. It's not my intention to say a great deal here about the events of the Rising itself, but of course they provide the context. The Chartists had arrived in Newport that Monday morning at about 8 o'clock. By 11 o'clock the correspondent from the Times had written that the rebels had gained almost entire possession of the town, and that the firing was still going on. And yet the Battle of the Westgate was quickly concluded. The Chartists began to flee up Stow Hill, scattering their weapons as they went. Charles Waters was seen running across the fields at Goldtops with soldiers from the workhouse in hot pursuit. But not everyone took to their heels. Some angry Chartists lingered, and like the wounded Jack the Fifer, considered launching a second attack. What was to follow, of course, was the last mass treason trial to take place in mainland Britain. When the Special Commission commenced its work, 14 bills for high treason were brought against the leading figures of the Rising. We should remember that there are many different stories represented in the pages of this chapter of history. Not least of these are the 5 other Welsh Chartists sentenced to death at Monmouth in January 1840. According to Professor David Williams, it was not until the 13th day of the trial that there was sufficient evidence to convict all 8 men. The breakthrough revolved around the case of Jenkin Morgan, who was a tenant of Thomas Prothero, who himself extracted evidence from James Hodge. On Thursday the 16th of January, the 8 men were brought to the bar to receive their sentences. The judges put on their black caps, but the initial death sentences were to be commuted to transportation for life. On Monday the 24th of February 1840, a petition was sent to Lord Normanby from Frost's elderly mother, his wife and his children, praying that the young Queen Victoria would grant Frost and his fellow prisoners a free pardon. This was acknowledged in a letter from Whitehall the following day, and delivered to W. F. Geach, who was staying at the Tavistock Hotel in Covent Garden. It informed them very succinctly that Lord Normanby could not advise the Queen to accede to their request. Meanwhile that afternoon the Mandarin raised her anchor at Falmouth and began her long journey, carrying Frost, Williams and Jones to Van Diemen's Land. At 5 o'clock on the morning of Friday the 28th of February 1840, Richard Benfield, John Lovell, John Rees, Charles Waters and Jenkin Morgan were removed from their cells at the county jail at Monmouth and sent to the penitentiary at Millbank. These two groups of Chartists were now set upon two very different courses. Their sentence at Millbank was intended to last for 5 years, meaning that their release was planned for December the 9th, 1844. Reports in regional newspapers suggested that they were all in good health, but it's difficult to be confident that this was the case. Arriving at the Millbank Penitentiary by boat, there's little doubt that they would have been daunted by the enormous shadow that this edifice now cast over their lives. They had been spared the fate of transportation for the term of their natural lives on a distant shore, but this was by no means a soft option for any man or woman during the 1840s. This was merely a different form of banishment. During the first half of the 19th century, the population of Newport had begun to accelerate rapidly as the effects of industrialisation began to spread through the coastal towns of South Wales. Yet in the autumn of 1839, Newport still functioned mainly as a small provincial town, having a population of approximately 13,500 inhabitants. Only 3 decades earlier, the maritime quarter of Pillgwenlly had been little more than a trackless marsh. The rapid process of change began with the construction of the Monmouthshire Canal across Pill in 1804. Soon these marshes were raised to a higher level to accommodate both the canal and the Sir tramroad that ran across its embankments. As a result, both the landscape and the character of Pillgwenlly were changing rapidly, and by the end of the 1830s plans were afoot to construct a town dock. This was eventually opened in 1842. The wharves of Pillgwenlly were now connected to the Sir Ironworks. The project was driven by the Morgan family and also by leading industrialists such as Thomas Prothero. Prothero leased out much of the land here and established the Tredegar Wharf Company. He then subleased land to his tenants, which included Jenkin Morgan. Prothero's assertion that all the Chartist lodges were based on beer shops and public houses was probably correct. The Beer House Act of 1830 enabled anyone to brew and sell beer on payment of a licence, which cost 2 guineas, and landlords of licensed public houses, taverns, alehouses, they could stay open until up to 18 hours a day. The Varteg ironmaster G.S. Kendrick described the beer shops as the proper nursery for all kinds of sedition and disturbance, and another ironmaster, Henry Scale, bemoaned the Cursed Beer Act, which had converted hundreds of cottages into sedition shops. So, who was Jenkin Morgan? Well, firstly, I think it's important to note that Morgan's power base was to be found in Pillgwenlly. With its pubs and beer shops, Pill was a closed working-class community. It's not surprising that it was an ideal breeding ground then for radical political ideas, and from the spring of 1839 the authorities seemed to detect a change in the audience and the speeches at radical meetings. Ivor Wilkes has said that the Pillgwenlly men were predominantly dock workers, but also included stonemasons, blocklayers and labourers. Processions tended to begin in the streets of Pill, and there are fears that navvies, canal boatmen and the unemployed and even criminals were beginning to be affected by Chartist propaganda. One such street was Quay Street, and this was the home to Jenkin Morgan. Jenkin Morgan was a prosperous milkman, a tallow chandler and a soap boiler. Although he was predominantly a milk vendor, he supplemented his income by making cheap low-grade candles from tallow or pig fat, and he was relatively prosperous. He said later that he had been in possession of 3 houses, 7 fine milk cows and other property, and yet it appears that Morgan had only lived in Pill for about 3 years. When he was put on trial, his landlord Thomas Prothero took possession of his hayrick. On the night of the 16th of January 1840, it was set on fire in an act of political revenge, following the passing of capital sentences on the Chartists at Monmouth. Despite offering a reward of £100 and Prothero writing to the Home Secretary, the case was never solved, and there's evidence to suggest that one of the arsonists was Benjamin Betts of Portobello, with the cause of his death being recorded as the mortification of a burnt leg. And one of his neighbours, of course, was the milkman, Jenkin Morgan. There's little doubt that Jenkin Morgan was a radical Chartist. He was certainly an admirer of Henry Vincent, a disciple of the evangelist of the West. He even spoke like Vincent, using the same biblical language. Maria Harper, giving evidence against Morgan, claimed that during the riots at Devizes during the spring of 1839, she had exchanged words with him. She was married to a police constable and had learnt of the events through her son, William Welsford Harper, who worked for the Merlin. It was here that Morgan allegedly went into a rage, saying, "I know who you are for. You are for the locusts that eat up the fat of the earth. Every one that will not join the Chartists should be mown down like grass." Mary Jenkins, too, of Key Street, also commented that Morgan had gone to Vincent's trial, while Frances Gibbon testified that Morgan had told her to expect bloodshed on the streets of Pill before Sunday night. From the trial evidence provided by William Stevens, a blacksmith, we know that Morgan was actively preparing for an armed struggle and was involved in the manufacture of weapons. Stevens, who had his own smithy in New Street, was making some of these pikes. In fact, Ivor Wilkes claims that pike making was already underway in Pill in the weeks after Vincent's arrest in May of 1839. Many of these weapons were also being manufactured by a 30-year-old blacksmith called John Gibby, who was employed at William Evans's foundry. Gibby was living in Cross Street with his wife and 4 children. A police search of his house after the rising discovered drawings of pike heads together with sets of accounts which covered a number of months. John Lewis of Pilgwentley stated that a man committed for stealing a hammer, on going to jail, told Rees that Gibby the smith made the pikes and he helped to grind them that Sunday before the riots. They were to go and meet Jenkin Morgan, and they met there and fastened on the pikes. A basic pike cost 1 shilling and 6pence and was often bought over 3 instalments of 6pence each. He pleaded guilty to riot and conspiracy before the Special Commission and was sentenced to 1 year in prison. At the core of Ivor Wilkes' Westgate lecture in 1989 was the conviction that the attack on the Westgate Hotel had been organised by sections of 10. He believed that these had been working under the umbrella of the Chartist lodges in South Wales. He described cells of activists, sections of 10, that had been secretly organised in the works and collieries. This theory is based upon the notion of 10 men, together with their captain, making plans under the umbrella cover of the Chartist lodges. He makes the case that this organisation predates Chartism and says it was concerned less about the political demands of the People's Charter and more on the economic dimension of wages, working conditions and hours of employment. These effectively had grown out of the Scotch cattle and had originated in the 1820s, long before the People's Charter had been written in 1838. The structure of this organisation was built on military principles. 5 sections equals a troop, 3 troops equals a company, 3 companies equals a brigade, and he claims that a plan existed to bring together 15 brigades by October of 1839, approximately 7,500 men. He agrees with David Jones here that the original date set for the rising was the 4th into the 5th of November, and that the plan was to seize the towns of Brecon, Abergavenny, Usk, Newport and Cardiff, holding the bridges in each of these locations as a defensive wall against the influx of soldiers. Wilkes regarded Morgan as the central figure in the Pilgwentley section of 10. As their captain, his orders came directly from Charles Waters. Again, this interpretation is supported by evidence provided by Morgan James, who had enrolled as a Chartist in Pilgwentley. On the night of the 3rd of November, the arrival of the Chartists from the hills at Stow Hill was meant to launch the Newport sections into action. Rockets were to be discharged by Jenkin Morgan men from a field near Christchurch, acting as a signal for the Newport men to go into action. Attached to this section were John Gibby, Edward Brickley and David Herrin. By the time the Blackwood and Tredegar columns arrived, however, it was nearly daylight, and the rockets were of little use. Much of the critical evidence against Jenkin Morgan was provided by Morgan James. Describing him as the captain, he testified that Jenkin carried a pike fixed to a long stick with a sharp crosspiece to cut the bridles of the cavalry horses. Jenkin Morgan had spoken to him of a simultaneous rising across the kingdom, and of a plan to take over the Newport workhouse and its arsenal, as well as the home of the magistrate Lewis Edwards. Morgan James added to his testimony that the Welsh Chartists believed that there would be a general insurrection throughout England, Ireland and Scotland on the same day, and that the charter would be the law of the land. He claimed that any men who had joined the Chartists but who refused to join the march would be the first to be killed. Any soldiers who refused to give up their arms quietly would also be shot. This plan was widely spoken of at the time, despite the interpretations that were later placed on it by historians. Jenkin Morgan had said that Newport would be invaded by hundreds of men coming through the Malpas, Stow and Portobello turnpikes, and that the soldiers would be surprised and disarmed. He had orders from Charles Waters to seize Aaron Crossfield's warehouse at Cinder Hill Wharf, where there was a great deal of gunpowder. The aim of this exercise was to provide sufficient gunpowder to destroy the bridge over the River Usk. Of course, none of this would actually take place. In both his 1989 talk and in his book, Wilk raises the role of Patrick Hickey and his section of Pilgwentley Irishmen. On the night before the rising, they had gathered at the house of John Lewis before moving towards the Marshes Gate to await the arrival of the Pontypool men. The Marshes Gate allowed access to Newport from Pontypool via the Turnpike Road. Certainly Pilgwentley had a significant Irish population in 1839. Even in the years before the mass exodus of the potato famine, the streets of Pilgwentley were awash with Irish families. Jenkin Morgan believed that Frost and his men would enter Newport by 2 o'clock on the morning of Monday the 4th of November. By the time the Chartists from the hills arrived, however, it was almost daylight and the rockets were of little use. Ivor Wilkes commented that at 3 a.m. the Pill section went home, convinced that nothing would happen that night. At 6 a.m. Jenkin Morgan was making his milk round as usual, and some of his men were pulled out of their beds at 8 a.m. with news of thousands of colliers coming down. Mapsam Thomas Smith, a farmer from Maesglas, stated that he'd seen him 7 hours later that Monday morning. He said he saw him at between 10 and 11 o'clock as he was riding into Newport. He added that he was with 3 or 4 men, straggling parties of men headed towards the Waterloo Gate. Some had guns, most of them were returning from the direction of Newport, several without hats. Morgan was walking quickly and he turned his head over his shoulder to avoid him being recognised. In her evidence, Frances Gibbon testified that Jenkin Morgan had left home the Wednesday after the riots, and that he has not been home since. David Jones writes that men involved in the rising made for Cardiff, Swansea and Carmarthen in the west, or to Brecon, Gloucester and Bristol. Despite his connections with Pill, Jenkin Morgan was very much a Glamorganshire man. The obvious choice for Morgan as he fled from Newport was to head westwards and to return to the rural landscape he knew best, the Vale of Glamorgan. It also seems highly likely that his brother Evan assisted him in his escape. Evan was a farmer of over 120 acres in Cornelly, near Pyle. By now a very large reward of £100 had been placed on Jenkin's head. He was a fugitive from justice, trapped within South Wales. He would have realised all too well the need to make it to the relative safety of London as quickly as he possibly could. Of course, there's little evidence that Jenkin actually went to Swansea at all, but he offered the story to the Bristol police, saying he'd been living in Swansea and that he came from Swansea to Cardiff and from Cardiff to Bristol that day. Assuming the account he gave to the Bristol police is accurate, he may have travelled to Cardiff by the mail coach. The Llanelli mail coach left the Mackworth Arms, which stood on the east side of Wine Street, at 6 o'clock every evening. The Cambry newspaper stated that coaches left the inn for the Bell in Gloucester and the Bush in Bristol, but Jenkin didn't travel directly to Bristol. We know with some certainty that he made his journey to Bristol from the Bute ship dock in Cardiff by steam packet, equipped with a plan to escape to London. It seems that he boarded the Lady Charlotte that morning with a ticket for Bristol dock. The tide dictated that the steam packet sailed at 9:15 that morning. As a wanted man, he was being hunted tirelessly by Constable Moses Scard, under orders from the Superintendent of the Newport Police Force, Edward Hopkins. It would seem probable that Morgan's whereabouts were being tracked, and that as he arrived in Bristol, he was being watched. Looking at the timetables for the steam packets, both the Usk and Glamorgan packets were in service that day, with the Bristol-bound steamer leaving Newport at 8:30 on that Thursday morning. This meant that the 3 Newport men who were eventually to snare him would have been able to reach Bristol in advance. Jenkin's steamer wasn't scheduled to leave Cardiff for another 45 minutes. This would have provided them with sufficient time at the quayside to wait for the Lady Charlotte to moor in the Bristol dock. They would have been able to observe Jenkin disembark, watching his movements and discreetly following him to the bunch of grapes. Phineas Sims gave evidence that he'd received information that Morgan was in the public house at about 2 o'clock. It seems unlikely that Morgan would have had time to do much else in Bristol other than to purchase his ticket at the coaching inn. The manhunt for the Chartists on the run had now extended into England. Police officers from Newport were scouring the villages between the River Severn and Bristol. Hopkins described the chase for Jenkin Morgan in a letter and fully expected to find him in Bristol. On the afternoon of the 14th of November, Jenkin Morgan was sighted in Bristol by John Lewis, who was a landlord from Pilgwentley. He was accompanied by 2 other Newport men, one of whom was Richard Ashfield. Newspaper reports record that they immediately sent for a Bristol policeman and that Morgan was arrested in the Bunch of Grapes, the Market Exchange, by Police Sergeant Phineas Sims in the tap room of the beer house. When John Lewis returned to the Bunch of Grapes, having procured a couple of policemen, he had shouted, "Lay hold of that man. It is Jenkin Morgan, the cowman. He is one of the rioters and is advertised by the magistrates of Newport." Morgan was seized instantly, but offered no resistance. When questioned, he persisted in saying his name was Morgan Jenkins. Morgan was taken to the police house, which was located in the old guardhouse close by in Wine Street. He was searched and charged, with Sims entering his name on the charge sheet as Morgan Jenkins, alias Jenkin Morgan. Sims later gave evidence to the Newport magistrates that Morgan drank up his beer and went with me to the station house. He stated that when searched by police constables, he was found to have 8 shillings and 6pence in cash, 2 neckerchiefs, a pocketbook, a knife and a comb on his person. Newspaper reports claim that Morgan had planned to take the Monarch coach from London. Yet Morgan told the Bristol police that he'd reserved a place at the Bush Inn coach house for the age coach, bound for London at 4 o'clock, at a cost of 18 shillings. When the police eventually visited the Bush Inn in Corn Street, they discovered that he had no box or parcel with him. Jenkin was clearly travelling light, hoping to make London in as little time as possible. This map reveals just how close the 3 key locations were to each other. They were all within walking distance, again suggesting that his arrest was not a coincidence. The road from Bristol to London was a very busy coaching route. In all, 342 coaches left and arrived in London every day. The terminus for 29 of these coaches was the Belle Sauvage on Ludgate Hill, and this was the route taken by the Monarch. It tended to leave Bristol at 5:15 p.m, making the 122-mile journey to Ludgate Hill in 15 hours, although probably 18 hours for a night journey. The age coach, however, operated out of the White Bear in Basinghall Street in London, and usually left the Bush Inn at 2:30 p.m, following a route to London via Bath, Chippenham, Caen, Marlborough, Hungerford, Newbury, Reading, Maidenhead and Slough. Had he been successful in reaching London, it's probable that the coach would have taken Jenkin Morgan to this particular inn, arriving in its enclosed courtyard early on the morning of Friday the 15th of November. But that morning was to witness Morgan being conveyed back to Newport by steam packet under the supervision of Sims. While the other passengers were landing at the Bristol wharf on the east side of the River Usk, Morgan pointed towards Ashfield. As he turned to Sims, he said loudly, There were my 3 neighbours who sold me. By the following Wednesday, Newport magistrates had committed Morgan on a charge of treason and sedition, and it was Moses Scard who was one of the first to provide evidence against Jenkin Morgan the next day. The capture of Jenkin Morgan was merely just one part of a widespread trawl for the men implicated in the rising. The manhunt was thoroughly conducted, and altogether a sum of £1,000, equating to approximately £1 million today, was made available to successful bounty hunters. By late November, more than 30 men had been imprisoned at Newport, while others were held at Pontypool, Usk and Swansea. Even the Newport workhouse, where the 45th Regiment was lodged, came to act as both infirmary and prison camp. On the 9th of November, the Treasury Solicitor, George Maule, had arrived in Newport to oversee the examinations. These were conducted at the Westgate Inn. The Whig government had provided him with a brief to play down the seditious nature of Welsh Chartism, and the Newport examinations lasted until the 6th of December. Over these weeks, 125 prisoners appeared before them. Of these, 21 were placed in the county jail at Monmouth on charges of treason, and Jenkin Morgan was one of these men. William Foster Geach and the other defence lawyers often clashed with the lead magistrate, the Reverend James Coles, and sometimes with Phelps and Thomas Prothero too. As Jenkin Morgan was being examined, James Hodge attempted to incriminate John Frost. Geach's temper snapped. He claimed that the prosecution was not obeying the letter of the law, and that Prothero was trying to obtain evidence against Frost without him being present. He said that unless Prothero could show that the evidence provided by Hodge affected the prisoner Jenkin Morgan, then it should not be allowed to be taken. Jenkin's claims of innocence were dismissed outright by the magistrates, but not wishing to prejudice his case before the Special Commission, they refused to make any observations. Jenkin Morgan then applied to the court to be allowed the use of pen, ink and paper whilst in jail, and for permission to speak to his wife before being sent to the county jail at Monmouth. He was informed that he should make an application to the visiting magistrates at the jail. He was allowed, however, to have an interview with his wife, but only in the presence of Police Superintendent Hopkins. And so Jenkin Morgan was sent to Monmouth for the next jail delivery to await trial on the charge of high treason and sedition before the Special Commission, which began on the 10th of December. On Wednesday the 15th of January 1840, Jenkin Morgan then changed his plea to guilty. The following day he was called again to the bar, together with Waters, Lovell, Benfield and Rees, to be sentenced to death. Justice Tyndall's words to Morgan were as follows: that you be taken to the place from whence you came, and from thence be drawn on a hurdle to the place of execution, and that you be there hanged by the neck until you be dead, and afterwards the head shall be severed from his body, and the body divided into 4 quarters, shall be disposed of as Her Majesty shall think fit. But the execution never took place. Morgan's sentence was initially commuted to transportation for life, and then reduced further to 5 years to be spent in the Millbank Penitentiary in London. In 1840, Millbank was the largest prison in Britain and was effectively a brick fortress. Standing only a few feet above the high level of the River Thames, it was considered to be extremely unhealthy. Although clean and well ventilated, it was exceptionally damp, and not surprisingly, fatal outbreaks of cholera occurred there during the 1840s and the 1850s. Its large external walls formed an irregular octagon, enclosing approximately 16 acres of land. Its ground plan resembled a wheel with a 6-pointed star. Inside, the prison was both heated and lit by gas, which was carried through its labyrinth of corridors by a vast network of lead pipes. As he confronted Millbank's huge wooden gates for the first time, imagination and empathy can equip us with a mere glimpse into what Jenkin Morgan must have felt as he confronted this intimidating symbol of penal retribution. After arriving at Millbank by boat, and entering through the gatehouse, the name Jenkin Morgan would have been carefully recorded in a ledger before he was taken to the governor's rooms, which occupied one side of the inner hexagon. On leaving the governor's office, all new inmates would be stripped naked and taken to one of the prison bathhouses. Each had a large water tank, which was filled with water from the river by a pump, and each circular washing area contained 4 baths. It was here that the newly arrived prisoners were scrubbed down and disinfected before being taken to the prison surgeon for a medical examination. Basic information about each prisoner was recorded, which included their weight, their height, and any distinctive marks. As they were led to their cells, the 5 Welsh Chartists would have encountered for the first time a very different system of penal control. This was worlds away from their brief experience of life in the county jail at Monmouth. Millbank had the capacity to confine 1,200 convicts in separate cells, and each arm of the Pentagon contained up to 15 cells. These cells rested upon thousands of huge flagstones. The space for each inmate measured just 12 feet by 7 feet, and they were very sparsely furnished. Each cell had a single window which looked into the Pentagon courtyard. The inner door of each cell was made of reinforced wood with a vertical letterbox slit for warders to look through. The outer door was secured with iron bars. The cells were equipped with a washing tub, a wooden stool, a hammock and bedding, and also books. These included a Bible, a prayer book, a hymn book, an arithmetic book, a work entitled Home and Common Things, and publications of the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge. Each prisoner was provided with his own eating utensils, which included a wooden plate and 2 mugs, one designated for gruel and the other for cocoa. A prisoner's day at Millbank began early. At dawn, the warders walked down the corridors, banging each cell door, and the first task for each prisoner was to empty his washing tub and to sweep the floor of his cell. Breakfast, which normally consisted of 1 pint of gruel and half a pound of bread, was eaten in the kitchen. Each pair of Pentagons had a kitchen which contained a row of coal-fired boilers with red copper lids. These could serve gallons of broth. These were run by warder cooks, who were also assisted by some of the prisoners. There were daily lessons with a schoolroom being attached to each pair of the prison's Pentagons. Large maps lined the walls, and lessons here included arithmetic, as well as scripture. Physical exercise lasted for an hour each day, and prisoners spent 3/4 of that time walking in silence around one of the 6 central courtyards in circles. Hard work was also considered to be an important component of reform, and there were workshops for prisoners between some of the Pentagons and the hexagon. The conduct of each prisoner was carefully watched and noted, and the most deserving received a good conduct badge. Much of Jenkin's day inside Millbank, however, would probably have involved activities such as oakum picking. This involved recycling old tarred rope and cordage. These then were painstakingly unravelled and taken apart into fibre. The oakum provided fibres needed in shipbuilding for caulking or packing, the joints of timbers in wooden vessels, and the deck planking of iron ships. The daily diet supplied to the Chartist prisoners was based on their prison classification. It was very basic and depended upon high levels of carbohydrate. Gruel, bread and potatoes were central to the diet, and when compared to workhouses in the same period, it's noticeable that there was less variety, less meat, fewer vegetables, and no beer. In the summer of 1842, the Radical MP Thomas Duncombe said the miserable diet had reduced him to a physical shell, and that he was dying by inches. At this point, Jenkin Morgan's health became the main driver in his release from Millbank. His case was pursued by a yeoman of the guard named Timothy William Castle. It's possible that Castle took up Jenkin Morgan's case because his wife came from Bridgend. It suggests that she knew the Morgan family or was even related to them. On the 4th of November 1842, he wrote to Jenkin's brother Evan, who was living in Cornelly near Pyle. He vividly described the dangerous condition that Jenkin found himself in by the winter of 1842. He had lost the use of his leg, allegedly from the mistreatment of a doctor. In turn, Evan wrote to John Illtyd Nichols, who was then the MP for Cardiff. He was a prominent member of the Glamorgan set and had inherited Merthyr Mawr House and estate on the death of his father in 1838. Significantly for Jenkin, Nicholl had been appointed Judge Advocate General in 1841. During the January and February of 1843, Nicholl wrote letters to H. John Manners Sutton, who was Under Secretary of State for the Home Department. Presumably he was also a friend within the newly formed Tory government of 1841. He therefore played a key role in Jenkin Morgan's pardon, as he certainly discussed the case with Sir James Graham, who was the Home Secretary after 1841. The medical report from July 1843 illustrates the point. William Bailey, the Chief Medical Officer at Millbank, reported that Morgan was suffering from weakness and lameness of the left knee. Yet the following month, the Home Secretary Sir James Graham stated that there were no grounds to justify him in advising the prisoner's liberation. But changes were already afoot at the penitentiary. In May 1843, Graham had already introduced a bill for an improved system of regulation at Millbank. In a letter sent to the Secretary of State in April 1844, Morgan expressed, quote, his heartfelt gratitude for the mercy with which my case has already been treated, and, as I have resolved never again to interfere with the political affairs of my country, either directly or indirectly, I hope Her Most Gracious Majesty will have mercy and grant my pardon this summer, that I may be able to make a home for my wife and children before the winter sets. On the 10th of May 1844, John Lovell, Charles Waters and Jenkin Morgan were granted a free pardon and were released from the Millbank Penitentiary. Almost 2 weeks later, Samuel Etheridge felt able to inform the readers of the Northern Star that John Lovell and Jenkin Morgan, two of the Chartist prisoners tried at Monmouth under the Special Commission, with Mr. Frost, myself and others, and sentenced with Charles Waters, Rees and Lewis to 6 years' imprisonment in Millbank Prison, have arrived in Newport. On that Saturday in May 1844, as he disembarked at the Bristol Packet Wharf on the banks of the River Usk, one can only wonder what thoughts filled his mind. Trudging or limping towards Newport Bridge on that spring day, he was without a home to go to. Etheridge wrote of the prospects of poor Mr. Morgan. His wife retired to her friends, and poor Morgan has returned shattered in his constitution, without a home to go to. Morgan was to plead with his Chartist friends to assist him, and consider him as one of the victims of liberty. We know from a piece in the Northern Star that Jenkin's wife was already in receipt of relief from the Wives of the South Wales Chartist Fund as early as December 1840, and yet Morgan was forced to plead with Fergus O'Connor for his personal intervention. His letter, which was published in the Northern Star, reveals the brutal impact of the years spent in Millbank. I, Jenkin Morgan, late of the town of Newport, am one of those unfortunate persons that have suffered 4 years and a half in solitary confinement, in that destruction of health and spirits, the penitentiary for the unfortunate Chartist movement of 1839. He asked his fellow Chartists that they might raise a contribution or loan to assist me to obtain 2 or 3 more cows and a bed to lay my distressed body on, so that I may follow my former occupation of milkman. I am still without a home, and no friends or means to get the above, but by the means of subscription or loan. My health is very bad, but still I am much better than when I left prison. These accounts provide a stark contrast to the return to Newport of John Frost just 12 years later. Frost also arrived by packet from Bristol, but his reception was very different. People soon recognised him. There were shouts of welcome. We are told he looked exceedingly well and heartily shook hands with a number of persons who pressed forward for that purpose. Upon taking his seat in the carriage, which was decorated with evergreens and flowers, the horses were taken out, and the carriage was drawn by the people through the town, to the Temperance Hall, Llanarth Street, where lodgings had been provided for Mr. Frost by the committee. Fergus Connor's response to Jenkin Morgan's plea was printed in the Northern Star on the 27th of July. Suffice it to say then, just that and no more, that I know of my own knowledge that every word in that letter is true, and that there is no more comfortable man, more happy man, more respected man than Morgan was before the Newport affair. When I go to Wales, where he is known best, it shall be a part of my duty to beg the means of restoring him to his former state of comfort and happiness, as I am determined that he shall not remain a Chartist scarecrow to be pointed at by Tom Phillips and Attorney Prothero. The scarecrow is profound, I think. There are parallels with the straw man in The Wizard of Oz. His character represents that of entrapment. He is tethered, static and powerless. He longs to escape from his pain, to dance and to be merry. In essence, he is searching for freedom, a freedom that only Dorothy can navigate him towards. Some commentators believe that The Wizard of Oz is an allegory for the Great Depression and American life in the aftermath of the Wall Street crash. One has claimed that because the straw man has no brain, he also has no hands and fingers to grasp a pen, to write a cheque, to pay a fine or a debt. After all, it's easy to forget that Yip Harburg, the man who wrote Somewhere Over the Rainbow, was also the person who penned the haunting lyrics of Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? A different century on a different continent, but the issues would have been instantly recognisable to all Chartists. A right-wing government, hunger, unemployment and anger. Effectively then, O'Connor was acting as a sort of 19th century Dorothy, someone who was able to release Morgan the Scarecrow from his entrapment and his ridicule. In December 1839, the Merthyr Guardian had commented that Jenkin Morgan, cowman of Pilgwentley, was one of the Morgans of Llandow near Cowbridge. Etheridge informs us that, since his arrival, he has gone into Glamorganshire, where he has a brother, a farmer living near Pyle. And I think by the mid-1840s he was living near Pyle and working as a farmer himself, close to Evan. On the 29th of January 1848, the Northern Star printed an advert for a commemoration dinner in Merthyr, held to remember the birth of Thomas Paine. It was to be held at the Barclay and Perkins, Pont Morlais, on the 1st of February, with supper being on the table at 7 p.m. The event was held by Jenkin Morgan, described as the Newport victim. This is the last record of Jenkins Morgan that I've been able to find to date. Despite his desperate contrition in Millbank, it illustrates that he was still involved in radical causes at the end of the 1840s. And so, very briefly, some conclusions on the Rising, in which Jenkin Morgan was involved. In 1984, Professor David J.V. Jones was interviewed by the BBC Time Watch programme. Here he made some very interesting points about the significance of the Rising. Firstly, that the Chartists were well aware that the number of soldiers in Britain at that time were quite low. They were aware too that the forces of the police were very weak. Secondly, what they were really concerned about was the fact that they'd been kept out of political power. They wanted to improve their conditions, but the only way they could see of doing that was eventually to take over the state. If Newport had been taken, there was the potential for a rolling revolution. He said, "I know from my research that there were Chartists in the West Riding and the West Country who knew it was going to happen and who were prepared to join in." And fourthly, this was the one time in the 19th century when a revolution was possible, and the Newport Rising was potentially the beginning of that national revolution. These conclusions are based upon evidence provided by many contemporaries. Sir John Campbell, for example, who was the Attorney General in 1839, said at Monmouth that the Chartists intended to change the law and constitution of the country by armed force. Sir Nicholas Tyndall also concluded at the trial that an assembly of men, armed and arrayed in a warlike manner, with any treasonable purpose, is a levying of war, and drilling and marching bodies of men are sufficient acts of overt treason. The use of violence in 1839 had massive ramifications for the British Chartist movement. The Chartists had effectively waged war on the state. They had taken up arms and had preached political revolution. The resultant need for retribution from both the local and national government had to be decisive. Jenkin Morgan was at the sharp end of their retribution. In 1839, the Whig government was effectively on its knees, both politically and economically. The radical reforms of its early years in office had dried up, and the economy had stagnated. The Tories went on the attack. Their view was that the Whigs had encouraged Jacobinism, and that the Welsh insurrection was, quote, the offspring of Lord Melbourne's own loins. The Whig newspapers rushed to support their cause, concluding that these madmen in Wales had set back the cause of reform and had united the higher and middle classes in dire hostility against their charter. Desperate that Wales should not be perceived as a second island, the Whigs were prepared to resort to the measures of political repression adopted by Castlereagh and Sidmouth in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. As a result, by the spring of 1840, over 500 Chartists had been sent to prison. While industrial workers in South Wales had acquired a new sense of political strength, they had singularly failed to topple the control of the coal owners and the ironmasters. In the final analysis, therefore, the Rising has to be regarded as a failure. The decision to resort to armed force in 1839 changed the direction of the British Chartist movement in the years that followed. Although significant events in 1842 and 1848 were to follow, the threat posed during the 1840s was very different in both character and execution. The momentum of the Chartist spring was never to return. On the 4th of January 1840, the Northern Star noted with concern that some Chartists were secretly plotting vengeance. Its cautionary view was that this is ill-advised in the extreme and must be everywhere carefully suppressed. The time for big words and loud talking is gone by. This message seems to have been well heeded in Newport. Speakers at local meetings stressed the need for peaceful agitation, and during the early 1840s, the strikes and plug plot riots of the Midlands and North of England made very little impact on Newport. The National Charter Association was launched in July 1840, and Dorothy Thompson has estimated that there were approximately 400 NCA members in Newport, and yet very little of note was to happen in the town again. David Jones comments that in the aftermath of the Newport Rising, and with the creation of the NCA, the men of principle and millennial vision now committed themselves to the humdrum world of politics and constitutional action. The NCA in Newport organised public meetings, either in the open air or in large public rooms. The campaign to pardon the 3 Welsh martyrs and all other political prisoners was a regular theme. One such meeting was held in the Police Court, Commercial Street, in December 1841, where another request was made for Queen Victoria to extend her royal mercy to those who were suffering a cruel bondage in a foreign land and pardon Frost, Williams and Jones. One of the main speakers, William Edwards, said he expected that Charles Waters, Lovell and Jenkin Morgan would be pardoned soon on the occasion of the christening of the Prince of Wales. He also hoped that Wright Beatty would be included. The position adopted on the Newport Rising by the main speakers that evening provides an interesting insight into the shifting position of Chartism in Newport by the end of 1841. So lastly, what did the Newport Rising achieve? Professor David Jones has concluded that the Newport Rising shocked the government into action and accelerated the improvements in the machinery of law and order, and ushered in fears that Britain had become a police state. Jones's view is that the Chartists had just one window of opportunity to achieve their goals, that this was the last rising. He says that this was one of the most important turning points in Welsh and British social history. Certainly, looking at the evidence supplied at the trial, Jenkin Morgan knew a great deal of the plans for the Newport Rising of 1839. Indeed, Morgan had said that there would be a simultaneous insurrection in Ireland, Scotland and throughout the whole kingdom, and that the charter would be the law of the land. And the last words of this presentation, therefore, are deliberately those of my old teacher, David Jones. This was the one time in the 19th century when a revolution was possible, and the Newport Rising, I think, was potentially the beginning of that national revolution.